They sold her laugh by the column and registered her angles in the city file. Tabby Marorrow, every headline said, was everything a room could want. Polished, lit, insured. The cameras learned her pauses like a language. Editors learned to fold those pauses into covers. Yet at the edges of the photographs, behind the varnished teeth of the parties and the lacquered speeches, she kept a corridor that was not for anyone's eye. The mansion on the city map could have been a single building or a dozen. Gala halls, penthouse terraces, abandoned playhouses, a stair of marble that never quite spoke of a proper owner. The city called it, half joking, the Mansion of Sin, a neat phrase that fit headlines and gossip. For Tabby, it named something larger, a house of rooms that required performance, and in those rooms, a hollow that applauded itself. She moved through those rooms the way a professional moves through a script. Her heels met stone and silk with equal precision. Her smile knew its cue. Parties provided the necessary emissaries, photographers who knew not to waste time on a false expression, hosts who expected her to be artfully absent even as she held the room together. At the stroke of midnight, she would sometimes drift from the gilt and glass and stand in a service corridor where the chandeliers made no promises. There, an amber lamp, always the same, burned as if someone had placed a memory on a pedestal and left it there to cool. Mirrors lined that narrow hall, not to reflect vanity, but to keep tally. They showed her the public angles first, then began, in some private slow motion, to show a person with pockets. A person with a name she could not recall when asked. She thought of forgetting as a petty failing at first, an overlooked line in an interview, a minor lapse. But then her name would slide, as if washed on a soap-slick window. In the middle of a conversation she would reach for the syllables and find them like coins at the bottom of a purse, slippery and uncooperative. She blamed fatigue, tears not yet allowed for the ledger of her life. She blamed late nights, and the way the city swallowed small things whole. Yet the corridor kept recurring in her nights, casting the same amber glow. Doors appeared along its length, numbered, but refusing to yield their purpose. Each door had a small brass plate. Each plate bore a name she almost recognized, and 4 keys that only chimed without opening. If you like quiet, strange stories stitched to the city, stay with this one a while. There's more to come. In the space between public adoration and private hunger, the watcher first found her. It was a gala, the sort that the city turned into a single, exhausted hymn, where rooms folded into rooms and people arrived wearing their best versions of forgetting. The Mansion of Sin that night kept every excess it had ever learned, a staircase that had once been carved from somebody's country estate, an orchestra that mouthed the right notes, waiters who moved like ghosts with trays of champagne. Tabby arrived in a dress whose color matched the city's last winter. Flashbulbs stung, editors called her name as if on a teleprompter. She moved through compliments with the practiced slowness of someone who had spent years making sure nothing personal leaked. He stood by a doorway that seemed to have no obligation to the party, under an amber lamp in a vestibule that made other late arrivals look small. He was in all ways wrong for that room. Unsuited to the artful cruelty of conversation, he did not burn with the sheen of performance. He burned, if the word could be used, with the peculiar steadiness of someone who kept watch in a house full of doors. He was not human the instant she noticed him. One of those immediate recognitions you might think more accurate if you had a name for it. But that impossibility arrived as a calm, not a horror. He smelled like rain and varnish, like something old that the city had misplaced for reasons it had never learned. His voice, when he spoke, made the air under the bell seem to hold its breath. He spoke in short declarative things, as if cataloging thresholds rather than making conversation. "You walk at night," he said, and the sentence landed like a coin on polished wood. It was not a question, and not a revelation. It was a naming. Names had always been the currency by which she traded. The right name for a room, the right inflection for her entrance. He offered a different kind of register. "You open doors you never meant to open," he said, and somehow the mirrors in the corridor seemed to tilt the world toward that sentence. They did not speak at length in the way the city expects meetings to proceed. There was none of the tiny humor that lubricates introductions, none of the flirty exchange that becomes itself a public image. Instead, their conversations landed like doors closing, deliberate, final, revealing only the seam. The watcher asked no questions about her schedule or the photographers who followed her. He asked, instead, whether it was tired. He named the ache she had never had language for, the small cavern beneath her ribs that applauded with nothing inside. Once noticed, the ache grew articulate. He did not offer explanations. He merely said that there were other houses, and that some doors were kept by those who remembered the people who wanted to forget. After that night their meetings multiplied like a rumor, each one in a different room of the mansion of sin. He had a habit of choosing marginal spaces, the upstairs of an abandoned theater where the velvet seats remembered applause like fingerprints, a penthouse balcony that looked over fogging bridges and high enough to make a hand tremble, a riverbank where the city kept its reflections for sale. Each place had an amber lamp, sometimes literal, sometimes only an amber light held in the watcher's hand like some small offering. In the abandoned playhouse, he watched as someone left them both a curtain of dust that smelled like old costumes. On the penthouse he pointed out a horizon that rented its colors to the city, and asked what it felt like to own a brightness. On the riverbank, he listened to the city throwing its image into the water and calling it fact. Between meetings, small fissures fanned out in Tabby's life. Names slid away. She would stand in an elevator that paused between floors and hear, in the suspension, a memory reorder itself. Friends' phone numbers unhooked, addresses traded for latitude and longitude. Mirrors sometimes hesitated, showing her a fraction too late, as if the reflection needed permission to be formed. At a fitting, a seamstress set a gown against her shoulders and asked, with that discreet interest of someone who has loved fabric for too long, what she would choose to keep. "My name," Tabby said without thinking, and the seamstress smoothed the cloth as if settling a child's complaint. On nights she did not meet the watcher. She would find empty pages in her journal where sentences should have been. She went to small, institutional places to seek answers in predictable ways. A public library where the stacks were a river of other people's names and the books smelled of a more patient kind of memory. A scholar who had once collected local myths in his spare time and who kept clippings like ceremonial knives. He offered her a rumor that sounded at once primitive and terribly modern. A catalogue of stories about threshold keepers, about people who traded pieces of themselves to fit into a world that prized the done and the perfect. There were footnotes and skeptical citations and, beneath that, a child's handwritten note about a light between buildings where nights were uneven. None of it explained why her mouth refused the sound of a friend's name, and yet each scrap of lore made the watcher less absurd. Nothing as neat as certainty, but something that felt like a map drawn by someone who had walked there before. If the city were a chorus, it sang in phrasings that were simple and cruel. Columns ran headlines that could be shrugged at like old linen. Missing, in all caps. Socialites' vanishing spawns, theories. Rediscovering Tabby, a timeline. Photographers continued to sell images. Her ankle as a punctuation. Her back turned in a crimson gown like a story suspended. People began to talk in the public language of rumor. Office pools, late-night shows that made sense of mystery by rounding it off to a joke. Children dared each other near the boarded stoop of the abandoned theater, betting whether the amber lamp could be seen through the slats. Old friends called and said conspiratorially, "Do you remember the time?" and waited for her to finish the sentence. She found she could only meet them halfway. The watcher never made the trade sound like a transaction. He described outcomes the way someone catalogs rooms, measured, almost archivally. "You will be full in a way that is not public," he said once, the amber light between them catching the edge of his words. "You will not be counted the same way. Names will not be the measure they are now." The loss was described by what it looked like in practice, the forgetting of certain measures, birthdays, ring sizes, the timbre of a laugh. The gain was described in terms of feeling, an absence filled by something that pulsed without being recorded. He never said soul, and never drew shapes for the mechanism that would do it. The adjectives were chosen like keys, precise, cold, and oddly tender. Tabby made lists. She could make lists for dinner guests and for outfits, and for the charities that required her endorsement. She made lists for the things she feared to lose and the things she had already lost. There were practical entries, her mother's favorite book, the measurements of a favored ring, and less practical ones. The moment she could pass a mirror, and not give a thought to the camera waiting 2 streets away. At night, under the amber lamp of her corridor, she imagined the fullness the watcher offered like a lake someone has told you is real, but has never let you touch. She tried to inventory her hollow. The way applause felt like a substitute heartbeat. The way applause corrected her hunger without filling it. The way a hand on the small of her back at a party could change the world with no knowledge of its contents. She weighed it all like a trustee. People assume that a public life is all glitter or all wolf. They mistake rehearsal for cynicism and mistake privacy for innocence. Tabby's life had been a continuous performance, yes, but it had not been all performance. There were rooms where she kept small artifacts of a private self. A letter that had never been sent, a music box with scales missing, a photograph of her as a child looking out at a sea she could not yet name. The thing the watcher offered was not exactly escape. It was not salvation. It was offered as a kind of filling, some other measure occupying the space that the world had been obliged to keep empty for the sake of spectacle. Between desire and refusal there stretched the city. Neighbors who expected runway-ready balls at the drop of a hat. Acquaintances whose conversation never stopped at the surface of weather. Editors who needed her to be both available and proper. There were relationships measured in appointments, lunches that were not really about hunger, and friendships that released their intimacy in press releases. Those were the conditions she considered when weighing the trade. If she took the watcher's offer, what would remain of Tabby Marorrow that the world could understand, photograph, and sell? If she refused, how long would the ache deepen until there was nothing left of her at all? He did not press. That was the hard thing to accept. Agency preserved even as the offer was laid out. He set thresholds before her like items on display, but left the key in her hand. He named the cost with a realism that did not sugarcoat how much would be lost. Some names will release themselves, he said, to make room for this. For a moment, she imagined all the ways the world might enforce memory as a mandate. The people who would call, the contracts that would cite her as an asset, the columns that spoke in possessive adjectives about her presence. She imagined walking out of a room and the city misplacing its file on her. When the choice came, it was not a theatrical climax. There was no bargain struck on the threshold with the clang of a bell. Instead, on a night that held the city's reign as if it too were listening, they met under an amber lamp in the corridor that had stitched itself through her dreams. The walls bore the soft wear of hands and the dust of halting footsteps. Mirrors lined the passage, and in them she could see the people who had applauded her from the wings, hands raised as if to hail something that flattered them. He stood there, a keeper of doors and nothing more, the lamps throwing his shadow long and wrong, longer than it had any reason to be, thinner than it could be humanly possible. She thought, in a sudden domestic flash, of calling a friend and humming a tune, of specifying the volume at which she wanted the world to remember her. She imagined a late-night interview where she would say, "I left to find myself," and the cameras would applaud the narrative and put it on a product shelf. She imagined slipping from a penthouse balcony into rumor like water, the kind of disappearance that would net editorials and a hashtag. What the watcher offered was none of those tidy disappearances. He put no instrument in her hand. He asked only that she name, out loud if she could, what she would be willing to trade. Tabby thought of the wedding invitations she had never declined, the unread books that lined a shelf, the list of acquaintances that had become a map. She thought of the museum-like quality of her own days, and how being filled might mean not being collectible. "I will lose measured things," she said finally. The line came out thin and ordinary, as if read from a receipt. She felt the words for a second as a cut on paper. Essential, necessary, irreversible. He nodded, as if closing a book. "Then, step through," he said, and the door at the end of the corridor, a door she had walked past each night, opened as if in recognition. She did not run. She did not argue. The certainty in her decision was not the arched confidence of someone casting herself into the void. It had the quiet steadiness of someone who had rehearsed something her whole life and finally came to the part where the actor stops pretending. Her heels were removed, one left by the little satin shoe tree by the sofa, an object that would later furnish tabloids and speculative columns. The other heel caught the lamplight like a punctuation before she set it down. She walked forward, the amber lamp making a path, and the mirrors watched without accusation or delight. At the threshold she felt, oddly, not terrified but curiously light, as if the city had been a heavy garment she had been taught to admire, and now found it burdensome. When she passed the door, There was no great sound. No orchestra swelled. No chorus of cameras snapped all at once. The city continued in its habitual way. Somewhere a cork popped. Somewhere else a writer found the gap useful for an elegant sentence. The door slid closed with a finish, like the last page turned. Her life, to those left on the outer side of that threshold, remained eerily intact. The penthouse unchanged, the dress in her wardrobe, a phone that still accepted texts. Yet a single shoe by the living room sofa became proof enough for those who needed a story. Editors reproduced photographs of the shoe as if holiness could be found in still life. Speculation followed as if it were taste. The city produced theories like accessories. Some said she had staged the disappearance for attention, an accusation that fit neatly into existing patterns and required no new vocabulary. Others whispered that she had been taken, abducted for reasons that made their owners sound more heroic. A small group built a counter-narrative about the Watcher, a mythic keeper of doors who offered a trade for the privately hollow. A scholar with a thin voice published an article that tried, with the good faith of academic curiosity, to place the story in a long lineage of threshold myths. Children dared each other to stand by the theater's boarded windows and say her name to see if the amber light blinked. The amber lamp became the city's way of admitting that not everything could be smoothed into a headline. It showed up where shadows kept their own counsel. Between the shuttered shops on a street that had been redeveloped into glass, above a stoop where teenagers met for the wrong reasons, at a window someone would later say they had glimpsed from a cab. The light persisted like a rumor, persistent and diffuse. Photographers caught glimpses of it on nights when the weather was willing. The images were grainy and beautiful enough to be condemned or worshipped, which in the city's habit are often the same. Stories multiplied. Some claimed the trade had been a bargain for celebrities' burdens. Others said Tabby had been tired of being measured, and so she traded metrics for fullness. A few told a meaner tale, that the mansion of sin had swallowed another specimen of its appetite. The variations said more about the tellers than about what happened. People need different endings. The city will always supply one to match day and night. Years afterward, there were still those who swore they had seen Tabby in ways that fit their wants. In the grain of a photograph, as an actress who had taken a new name, in the face of a stranger who smiled with a remembered joke. The Watcher remained a thin rumor, a presence that crops up in conversations when the light blurs and the conversation approaches the impossible. A scholar included his clipping in a university's folklore archive. Someone wrote a poem about amber lamps and the economy of names. It was published in a magazine and read at midnight readings where people imagined themselves brave. A small gallery of images continued to circulate. The shoe beside the sofa. The empty place setting at a charity gala. A magazine spread featuring Tabby's gowns, with an editor's note about absence as aesthetic. People debated whether her absence had been a performance or an enactment of something like freedom. In the quiet corners of the city, teenagers dared each other to walk the corridor at night, to seek the amber light, to push doors and see what happens. A handful returned with tales of a voice that sounded like space under a bell, of rain that smelled like varnish, of a corridor that made mirrors hesitate. Some came back with hands that trembled and an unwillingness to speak of the rest. The city loves a neat moral. It is less comfortable with the slow, hard fact of a person electing her own disappearance. That Tabby had agency, that she weighed and then chose, made the story rancorous for those who crave punishment and consoling for those who need examples of brave unmaking. None of the available narratives could reduce the choice into a slogan. None could keep her in the sentence they preferred. Sometimes, on late nights when wind scraped at the glass and the city seemed to inhale, the amber light could be glimpsed between buildings, a private glow that refused to be catalogued. People would say they saw it and felt the familiar tug of yearning for a fullness that did not count itself publicly. The watchers who awaited explanation found only the shape of a corridor in their mouths, and the memory of a name that would not entirely settle. They spoke in fragments. She wanted, someone would begin, and the sentence would be left on the lip of the public. The last image of Tabby that the city agreed upon was partial and precise. A shoe by the sofa. The faint impression of a heel on a rug, an amber lamp visible beyond a curtained window, and the knowledge that the cameras could no longer measure what had been traded. Some days the city sighed and called it a scandal. Other days it raised a glass to the ineffable. The Watcher retreated into the places where doors are numerous and unattended, where households have long corridors and dusty mirrors, and the city does not lay a map. He continued, as far as anyone could tell, to keep the doors, to light amber lamps, and to name without explanation. The legend did what legends do. It layered itself over the facts, enhancing them where they needed more mystery, and smoothing them where the truth was inconvenient. Photographers who had once taken her pictures still kept some frames in locked drawers. A friend of hers, an editor who had stopped calling after the second missed meeting, kept a postcard of that one photograph. Tabby, laughing, the picture taken by a street that had more light than weather, and would, in the privacy of late hours, lay a finger over the area where her name had been printed and find the ink cold. Children on bookstore steps dared each other to whisper her name into the spine of a book and wait for the amber lamp to answer. The city told versions of the story that made its streets seem more dangerous or more generous, according to the teller's taste. Sometimes, in the hush after a party breaks and the chandeliers have blown out, people find themselves listening for a voice that sounds like space under a bell. They remember, with the clarity of something boiled down by time, a line that was spoken in a vestibule. You walk at night. They think of corridors, and the small lamps that do not fit in the municipal plans, and of the ways we bargain with ourselves for relief. The mansion of sin remains an image the city can carry without owning. It is a place made of rooms that require performance and applause, a metaphor that fits the best-dressed as well as the worst-dressed, and in its hallways it keeps a lamp that will not, for reasons unknown, stop shining. What happened to Tabby is a story that keeps changing. For some, it is a cautionary tale about what a life of performance can demand. For others, it is a myth of reclamation. For a few, it is a small comfort. Someone chose to be full, even if fullness could not be televised. In certain nights, when rain makes the streetlight bleed into amber, you can stand where the theater's boards have been nailed shut and hear, as if from another room, the sound of heels that have already learned their new rhythm. You might think you can see the lamp. You might not. Either way, the city keeps the rumor close, like a hand in a pocket. Share this with someone who lingers between light and shadow.